on employer engagement in workforce data. Before we get into today's topic, I'm going to provide a little bit of background on the Workforce Data Quality Campaign. Next slide. So WDQC is a nonprofit initiative that advocates for inclusive, aligned, and market-relevant education and workforce data that can help our nation's human capital policies meet the challenges of a changing economy. We work at both the federal and state levels to promote policy reforms that support data systems which provide useful information for policymakers, students and workers, business leaders, and educators. Our policy agenda was developed by a broad coalition of national organizations, state leaders, and technical experts from across the education and workforce spectrum. Next slide. In particular, we work with several national partners listed on this slide, including National Skills Coalition and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. We're very happy that the Chamber will be presenting about some of their work on today's webinar. And WDQC's work is made possible by foundation funding from our foundation partners. Next slide. So to introduce today's topic, in conversations about workforce and education data policy, we often talk about the data needs of students and workers, program staff, and state and federal leaders. It tends to be a little less common to hear a focus on what data employers need, but employers use a variety of information to be successful. For example, businesses need information about worker credentials in regional labor markets when they're thinking about relocating or expanding, and they want to understand career trajectories as they think about recruiting and training their talent. Even basic decisions like setting a wage for a new position requires data about average wages for a particular occupation. Employers use their own data on employees, as Jamie will talk about later in the presentation, and they also use data generated by state and federal agencies. For example, a 2014 survey by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, BLS, suggests that hundreds of industry associations and private businesses around the country use its data when making decisions. WDQC also did an informal survey, and we asked more than 24 employers, small and medium-sized employers, from the Business Leaders United for Workforce Partnerships organization, another of our partner organizations, and we asked those employers to report on their use of public data sources, and we found that more than half of them turned to BLS data when determining where to locate or expand a business or make future investments. In addition, state data systems can be another important source of information, as we'll hear from some of our panelists today. Next slide. I'm really excited to introduce our panelists for the day. So first we will be hearing from Jay Moon, who is the chair of the State Longitudinal Data System Governing Board in Mississippi, the chair of the State Workforce Investment Board, as well as the CEO and president of the Mississippi Manufacturers Association. Next we'll hear from Martha Miller, an attorney with Balkin Bingham, and she has played an important role with the Alabama Workforce Council in advocating for stronger workforce policy as well as a state longitudinal data system. And finally, Jamie Francis from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation will talk to us about some of the ways that employers are better using their own data to think about hiring and promotions. She's the Senior Manager of Programs and Operations at the Chamber Foundation's Center for Education and Workforce. Jay, why don't you start us off?
Well, great. Well, Rachel, thank you very much for that introduction. I want to thank WDQC for the opportunity to be on the webinar today, and also it's a pleasure to be on with my fellow panelists. As you can see in the slide that you see right now, as Rachel mentioned, my day job, so to speak, is as CEO and president of the Mississippi Manufacturers Association. And critical data regarding employment is so very vital for manufacturing today. We are competing around the world in good quality data that we can base decisions on is uppermost in the mind of my members and those that I represent. And so getting that information, such as wages and other information that Rachel mentioned in the introduction, is very, very important. And so I have been involved in the workforce effort in the state for many years, and what I'd like to do this afternoon is to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've been able to do through the State Workforce Investment Board and the State Longitudinal Data System in order to take information and make it available so that good decisions can be made both on the state level and on the individual private sector level using that data. Next slide, please. What we have here is a 15-year overview of what we've been able to do in the state. So we've been working on this quite some time and putting the pieces together in order to create a system whereby we have the kind of information that we need in order to make decisions for both state government, resource allocation, and how we can make good quality information available to the private sector for their use. And what we call our program in the state is LifeTracks. And this is really a program that has expanded over the previous governor, Governor Haley Barbour, and gone into our current governor, Phil Bryant. And a couple of things I would just mention along this timeline is in 2000, we began to talk about the concept of the state longitudinal data system and began to think about what we would need in terms of information. In 2004, with the Comprehensive Workforce Training and Education Act, set a blueprint for data sharing agreements with workforce entities, which is really first of its kind in the state. We then, in 2006, created a state data clearinghouse, which is a group up at Mississippi State University, NSPARC, that actually takes in and then does the analysis with the data that's needed. Then in 2009, we moved quickly to actually the governor establishing the state longitudinal data system, and that bill passed in 2011 through our legislature, and then we began to move into the operation of the board over the last 2 years. And for those of you not familiar with the state longitudinal data system, it's really an ability for states to put together over a decade worth of information on public sector entities, particularly in the area of education, but we've expanded it to include all major state agencies so that that information is available to the public, but also you can use it to do longitudinal analysis across data sets, across agencies, so that you can really begin to understand the impact of the data and what it means in terms of policy decisions. And so you can see as of this year, we've actually produced more than 300 reports that have been put together at the request of the legislature, the governor, and other entities. Next slide, please. This gives you an idea of our governance board. It's a very formal board that we've put together, and you can see all of the agencies in state government that are involved and are members of the board. And so they are all part of this board by virtue of data sharing agreements that they have agreed to provide the information to the state longitudinal data system staff so that we can do the analysis, post the information on the website. So these are 12 major groups, and it really makes a difference in terms of being able to do the cross-platform analysis over a period of time that is necessary. Also, according to the state statute, the State Longitudinal Data System Board has rulemaking authority, and so as we establish the rules in terms of how we go about ensuring the integrity of the data, ensuring that the process whereby we take the data and produce reports are actually very sound and are reviewed by a panel from our research universities. So this is started out with just our educational groups and then has broadened into this much broader group within state government. Next slide, please. The objectives that I had with the State Longitudinal Data System, and this was a part of my responsibility as the chairman of the State Workforce Investment Board, was to stand up this program. It had been talked about, it had been thought about and reviewed over the years. There were pieces put together, but the formal program wasn't put together. And so what I really wanted to do with the program representing the private sector on this board, and if you can see on the previous slide on the board, I'm the only private sector representative on that board. And what we wanted to do is we had a lot of data. There's a huge amount of data, more data than we've ever had at our fingertips before. It's to take that data and turn it into smart data so that we can use it from a policy standpoint and a resource allocation standpoint. And we wanted to move from the anecdotal to the factual. We began talking about certain ideas. Well, if this happens, doesn't this happen on the other end? But we weren't able really to prove it. Now with the data and utilizing the data that we have, we can actually show causality. We can show that if something happens on one end of the process, it will produce benefits or negative possibilities if we don't do something about what we're seeing. And then move all of this from simply information and reports to actionable performance metrics. We want to be able to say at the end of the day that we are measuring the utilization of resources, whether it's federal, state, or private sector resources, all of which were being brought to bear on workforce development in the state. We wanted to make sure that we had an ability to review that, monitor it, and ensure that what we are trying to do with those resources is actually producing a benefit to the private sector, whether it is an individual that has a higher skill set, or we are trying to do something in ensuring that more people graduate from high school, and the list goes on and on. Next slide, please. Okay. From the business perspective, it was very important to bring efficiency and effectiveness to state government, because in the past, all of the individual state agencies had information, but that information wasn't put in a readily accessible form. It was difficult to get to, it was time consuming, and there was no source that you could go to that would look across over a decade's worth of information, and that you could use across platform analysis, as I mentioned before, to where we can actually access information from the Department of Health that doesn't violate HIPAA regulations, or we can access information, wage records that didn't violate other federal guidelines and so forth. So we needed to be able to do that so that we could begin getting this data, verify the data, make sure that it was correct, and then being able to use it to do these reports. So we wanted to knock down silos and build bridges. We wanted to move very quickly away from people holding the information and not releasing it in a timely way to where we could actually use it so that everybody is communicating and working with each other. We wanted to help the business sector avoid making bad decisions, as we mentioned at the start of the program. Better data, quality data, ensures the reduction of risk, which is one of the big issues that the business community looks at. How can I avoid risk? How can I get good data so that I can make decisions that are going to have an impact on my company for a number of years in the future? And we wanted to provide data to counteract bad information that could result in policies that in some way might be harmful. Again, moving from that anecdotal to the factual, being able to say, we're not guessing anymore. We actually understand the causality of what is going on, and we need to be able to direct resources to be able to deal with those issues over a period of time. Next slide, please. So how have the businesses been able to use this information? Well, we've used it for a number of businesses. This is just a few, but I would talk about these just very, very briefly. Nissan came into the state about 10 years ago, and so there was a great amount of state resources that were put into supporting Nissan as well as their own private sector resources. So after 10 years, it had been projected, and I worked on the Nissan project when I worked for the State Department of Economic Development. It was projected that it would pay back the amount of resources that were put in by the state over a period of time, and certainly 10 years was the first window. And so we were able to do an analysis with this information from the SLDS program to demonstrate not only that they had paid back the resources in a variety of ways to the state, but it also had added tremendously to the economic vitality of the state. It added more businesses and created more opportunities than could have been anticipated in the beginning. A couple of years ago, we were able to bring in Toyota's new manufacturing facility, and this information was very critical in the use of being able to recruit the roughly 1,600 employees that they have in that facility in North Mississippi. So it was very, very critical in looking at those skill sets that they absolutely needed to have in order to produce a world-class product. Most recently, we've had Yokohama Tire that's located in the northern part of the state, and they had some very, very specific requirements and skill sets that they were looking for, both in the blue-collar side and in the white-collar side. And so we were able to go out and very clearly demonstrate to them, because of the information we had through our program, the LifeTracks program, that we had those resources, we had the availability of the workforce, we had the skill sets that they could count on in the area that they were going into the state. And it was the critical point that made the difference, because they were looking at some 120 different locations around the country, and it enabled us to bring the project into the state. And then finally, on a regular basis, economic developers all over the state, including private sector businesses, are using this information on a regular basis. So they're able to call in, get information on wage rates, their information on the availability of labor, both the private sector and the public sector working together in order to ensure that we take advantage of the opportunities, either expansions of existing businesses or the recruitment, such as the three I mentioned before, to the state over a period of time. Next slide, please. And so really that very quickly sort of sums up what we've been able to do over the last 15 years to really bring it all into focus, use the information to support the private sector, use it to support their partners, the economic development groups and communities around the state, in order to enhance the ability for them to make sound decisions when they are either locating a facility or expanding a facility or simply adding on to their workforce when they have a vacancy. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to take questions later on in the program.
Thank you so much, Jay. Martha, we're excited to hear from you about Alabama's experience.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you for inviting Alabama to be a part of today's webinar. My name, as she said, is Martha Legg-Miller, and I am presenting to you today on behalf of the Alabama Workforce Council. I serve in an advisory capacity to the Council and have been particularly involved in the data initiatives that the Council has recommended. Next slide, please. The Alabama Workforce Council is a group of thought leaders representing the top levels of industry, education, and government from across the state. Next slide. By way of background, in January of 2013, Governor Robert Bentley signed Executive Order Number 36, creating the Governor's College and Career Ready Task Force. The task force was chaired by the Governor and co-chaired by the Lieutenant Governor, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Pro Tem, and the Secretary of Commerce. 16 other members were appointed by title, with significant representation from state leadership and education leadership in particular. The task force was charged with developing strategies for improving educational outcomes and promoting general workforce and economic development in the state. One of the key recommendations of the task force was the creation of a permanent body that would be responsive to industry needs in developing and training our state's workforce. In reaction to that, during the 2014 legislative session, the Alabama legislature passed Alabama Act 2014-16, which created the Alabama Workforce Council. Immediately after the session ended, Governor Bentley started making initial appointments to the council in July of 2014. The appointees to the Alabama Workforce Council are representative of business and industry executives and education leaderships from across the state. In its enabling legislation, the legislature tasked the Alabama Workforce Council with advising, supporting, and promoting the coordination and collaboration across the state's pre-K through 12th grade, community colleges, and four-year universities, and the state's business and industry on both the local and state levels. Importantly, the Alabama Workforce Council was established as a purely advisory body. It has no regulatory or budgetary authority, but instead issues recommendations that are delivered to the governor's office and the state legislature annually. Next slide, please. The mission of the Alabama Workforce Council, as set forth in the legislation, is listed on this slide, including to enhance education and industry collaboration on an ongoing basis, promote educational access, articulation, and communication along the educational pipeline, to ensure appropriate development of essential workplace skills or soft skills, to raise awareness of and promote access to high potential career pathways, and to encourage more participation in projected high demand, high wage career opportunities, which, as we all know, come at the request and the recommendation of industry. To accomplish these missions, the Council wound up dividing into 4 committees by subject matter expertise, including marketing and promotion, public-private partnerships, workforce structure and alignment, and then education and industry collaboration, which is actually, that last committee is the one that recommended the creation of the P20W longitudinal data system for Alabama. Next slide, please. This map shows the 10 workforce regions of our state, with a star marking the location of each workforce council member. As you can see from the map, the governor's office deliberately chose members who are representative of all regions of the state, which has been critical to our success. This means effectively that when a recommendation of the council requires legislative action, there are very few legislative districts that are not touched by council membership, either their company or their employees that are there. Additionally, the governor's office made sure that the members of the Alabama Workforce Council were representative of the diverse industries of our state, including aerospace, automotive, banking, construction, healthcare, financial services, manufacturing, and utilities, just to name some of them. But perhaps most important to the success of the Alabama Workforce Council is not just the regions or the industries represented, but the specific individuals that were chosen to be a part of this group. The AWC is currently comprised of almost 40 high-level executives from some of the biggest employers in the state of Alabama. That means that when the Alabama Workforce Council recommends a course of action be taken, the rest of the state really takes notice. Our state leadership respects and importantly responds to the judgment of these leaders. And I cannot emphasize enough how critical this has been for Alabama and how important it would be for other states who are interested in forming a permanent advisory body like the Alabama Workforce Council. While the membership does turn over, members have terms of between 1 and 3 years, it is a requirement that these members be really and truly the leaders of the state and the leaders of industry in the state to make sure that we have the right people at the table advising. Next slide, please. Although the focus of today's presentation is on data, which was one of the recommendations of the Alabama Workforce Council, I want to highlight the broad scope of the recommendations that the Council delivered in January to provide some context. The first recommendation was the establishment of a statewide longitudinal data system, or the Alabama P20W data system, which I'll discuss in a bit. The second recommendation was to create a statewide awareness campaign and a career fair and trade show strategy. This is now underway and will hopefully be implemented soon. The third recommendation was to develop a one-stop shop online resource for Alabama's workforce development information. The AWC has supported utilizing certain funds that have been earmarked for marketing for technical education for the creation of this site, and there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes to make that happen right now. The fourth recommendation was to fund 44 additional career coaches, which would allow every high school to have a dedicated career coach in each school at least once per week. During the 2015 legislative session, the Alabama Workforce Council helped secure $500,000 in new funding for career coaches and up to $700,000 in conditional funding for more career coaches. We are about halfway there to our goal, but are really making some great progress. Next slide, please. The fifth recommendation was to support legislation that promotes public-private partnerships as that legislation comes forward. The sixth recommendation was to review the current workforce development functions and establish a more streamlined, centralized, and accountable organizational structure. In response, what the state did is they actually developed and passed House Bill 554 to reorganize the workforce functions of our state government, which has resulted in significant consolidation of workforce function. This bill was actually shepherded through by State Representative Alan Baker, who is also a member of the Alabama Workforce Council. So again, highlighting we have the right people on the council to make sure that things happen. The seventh recommendation was to codify and fund the Regional Workforce Development Council. As you saw a few slides back, the map of the state. These regional groups have previously existed by executive order only, and so legislation was passed during the 2015 session that would codify the councils and adopt new guidelines that emphasize business and industry engagement on the regional level. The eighth recommendation was to review the structure and alignment of the state's workforce investment boards. In connection with the restructuring under House Bill 554, the state WIBs were reassigned under the Department of Commerce and are currently conducting a self-assessment. One of our former state representatives, George Clark, who is also a co-chair of the Alabama Workforce Council, is responsible for this process. Again, I go back to the importance we've got the right leadership as a part of this group. So as you can see, there's a whole lot that the Alabama Workforce Council is tackling beyond the data system, but that has been one of their key priorities, and it was the first numbered recommendation in what was delivered to the governor in January. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the Education and Industry Collaboration Committee recognized early on that the state lacked what many other states had in a centralized statewide data repository that linked educational and workforce records. It was something that we were missing out on as a state, and it was a recognized hole that really needed to be filled. The statistics from the Data Quality Campaign and then the Workforce Data Quality Campaign really helped to drive that message home. There's nothing quite like a map that shows your state in a different color than all of the other ones around you. Alabama's current data systems are housed in their respective education and workforce agencies and operate without any significant interaction or communication. What effectively happens is it results in duplication of efforts, and we're unable to provide our students, parents, education officials, and government leadership with the best information that they need to improve education and workforce outcomes. So as a result of the investigation that the Workforce Council did and the research and talking to different state leadership, the Workforce Council recommended the development of a P20W longitudinal data system that would integrate educational and workforce information in the state for the first time. Next slide, please. After delivering that set of recommendations and pretty quickly upon the closing of the legislative session in May, Governor Bentley signed Executive Order Number 6, which mandated the creation of the Alabama P20W longitudinal data system, and it created the Alabama Office of Education and Workforce Statistics, which is an office that is administratively housed within the Department of Labor. Rather than creating a new entity, it's a part of the Department of Labor, but it is its own office. And this structure was chosen to, among other things, comply with certain unemployment insurance disclosure requirements. The executive order also set forth certain requirements for the provision of data, how the data is used, and then how the system is governed. With the privacy, security, and confidentiality of student information at the forefront of everyone's minds, the governance requirements in the executive order are importantly more protective of student information than any previously existing federal or state laws that had been applied in Alabama. So that was a very big deal to have that as a part of it. Lastly, the executive order established an advisory board to oversee the office. Next slide, please. This diagram shows the structure of the Office of Education and Workforce Statistics. And I'll note that as of right now, no employees have officially been hired by the office. It is pending allocation of funding that is necessary to begin operations of the office. But right now, the governor's office has indicated that they plan to include an allocation of funding for this in the upcoming budget. Next slide, please. So this is a list of the composition of the advisory board, which is 18 people that represent each of the bodies that will be providing data to the office, as well as a representative of the IT industry with expertise in data systems, a representative of the public, and a representative of local superintendents. This was very important to have the right people that will be a part of the decision-making for this group. The chair and co-chair, as well as a number of individuals that represent most of the agencies you see on this page, worked with the Alabama Workforce Council and put a lot of time and effort into developing a plan for the state's P20W longitudinal data system. So at the end of the day, this was a plan that was initiated by industry, and then it was supported by government leadership, and ultimately it was implemented, and it is being implemented through broad collaboration between industry and our government and education leadership. Next slide, please. This diagram has been the guiding force behind the Alabama Workforce Council promoting the establishment of the P20W system. And really, at the end of the day, the mantra of the Workforce Council has been the better quality education and training that the state can provide, the stronger workforce we will have, which will then serve to bolster our state's economy and in return create more tax dollars that can further fund education. This is a feedback loop that the Alabama Workforce Council will continue to foster in the years to come. This is not just a temporary body that issued one set of recommendations. They will continue to work and continue to meet on a regular basis to ensure that this feedback loop becomes stronger in the years to come. And next slide, please. Oh, that was the end. Well, that was all that I had for everyone today. I appreciate everyone's time and look forward to taking any questions at the end.
Thank you so much. And Jamie, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Chamber Foundation's work?
Great. Thanks, Rachel, and thanks so much to WDQC, not only for allowing us to be partners in their long-term work, but obviously the opportunity to talk with you all today about a project that we've been working on that we fondly refer to as Talent Pipeline Management that we started in June of 2014 thanks to the support of USA funds. As Jay and Martha illustrated, we're not necessarily short of data, but we do feel that there is great opportunity to improve how employers tap into their internal and external sources of data to transform it into smart data. We feel very strongly that there are plenty of those opportunities, and TPM really helps us illustrate that. Employers have access to many different types of data systems, including their applicant tracking systems, their HR management systems, as well as external resources such as LinkedIn and state resume banks. But the Talent Pipeline Management takes us through a step-by-step process that really empowers employers to leverage their voice since they have the greatest capacity to hire people for jobs. Next slide. So essentially, we're trying to answer two very important questions. Where do employers get their best talent today, and where will they most likely get their talent in the future? Essentially, what we're trying to do is find the right talent for the right position at the right time. So Talent Pipeline Management, and specifically one of its strategies, Talentflow Analysis, attempts to answer those questions. If employers do know the answer to these questions, a lot of times they hold it close to their vest to give themselves a competitive advantage. But Talent Pipeline Management and Talentflow Analysis really encourages employer collaboration through an employer collaborative. Some of you are familiar with this term. For those who are not, it's a voluntary assembly of business members that share a common incentive, which is to improve the talent flow process, inflows and outflows of trying to identify core competencies and fill the most needed jobs for their particular industry. For many employers, however, they don't know the answer to these questions. So we attempt to support employers in identifying and engaging both public and private providers that have the capacity and commitment to provide the right talent for the right position at the right time. Next slide, please. The first step in this is identifying core capabilities, and I'm sure it's no surprise to all of you that many times what we hear from both potential employees as well as from employers is that there's sometimes a disconnect between the human resources office to the line manager or hiring manager, and then even the public-facing person who is oftentimes out at college fairs or trying to recruit people from one-stop shops of exactly what employers are looking for. So we're trying to identify how employers can better link their talent strategy to their business strategy. And oftentimes what that means is identifying who those key people are. Is it your finance person? Is it the line manager? The HR manager? Who would be able to communicate what those needs are for the organization. So identifying short and long-term labor forecasting for what those key positions are that are critical to an organization's growth and competitiveness. Next slide, please. The next part of this is workforce segmentation. So trying to identify from where do you get your best talent for those specific positions. And we identified three potential choices, one of which is promoting from within. The second is hiring experienced workers from other organizations or hiring newly trained workers. So we're trying to determine our options for sourcing each capability. Sometimes people have a current strategy that they think works well for them, but if they dig a little bit deeper and use the data systems that we're encouraging them to, it may be that they find a better alternative. It may actually vary each strategy for what capability you're trying to fulfill, but taking the time to identify what method works best and would be most efficient and effective will certainly lower long-term hiring costs, both monetary as well as from a time perspective. One great example of this is Caterpillar Inc., who identified 6 core positions and created competency maps to define what skills and characteristics were needed to perform those jobs best. Since they were able to use those maps, they can now look ahead and identify which employees will be eligible for those roles 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, and then have been able to create the supports that are needed to assist those candidates improve their skills along the way. Next slide, please. The next piece of this is trying to look at simple and extended value chains. So for positions that cannot be done in-house by hiring from within, we need to identify those partners that work best for us. So employers who are either working as individual organizations or as the collaborative that I mentioned earlier need to really be thinking of themselves as end customers of talent and make sure that they're building talent pipelines for new hires that are able to be communicated very clearly. So to do that, we really encourage people to have very open relationships with those providers so that they can gain a solid understanding of what it is that you need. There might be multiple tiers. We have identified a number of different tier systems. So if you're getting direct hires from those sources, that's a tier 1. So perhaps that's an employer sourcing right outside of a high school career technical education program. Or perhaps it's the high school program is actually a tier 2. They typically go from the high school CTE program on to a technical college and would then go to the employer. That's an example of a tier 2. No matter what the idea is, you really need to figure out what are the supports that can be put in place to make sure that those providers are really clear with what type of talent you're looking for and what types of supports they can offer the students while they are with the provider. An example of this is Work America, which is a recruiting firm. Their model acts as an intermediary between providers and employers. So they first help employers define the skills that they need to meet those core needs that the employer has identified, and then they can help identify the programs within their network of providers that teach those skills. So they are able to aggregate that talent from numerous partners by identifying the strong candidates in the initial phases of training and then brokering commitments from employers to hire those candidates upon graduation. We have a really great case study of this on our website, and I'll be sure to mention that towards the end of the presentation. Next slide. So all of what we're trying to do here is to evaluate our partners and make sure that we're using our internal and external data systems to do that. So we believe that what you measure is what you get. So employers can develop their own balanced scorecards that address time, cost, and quality across partners and support measures such as time to full productivity. We're trying to figure out how we can get the highest quality hires in the shortest amount of time for the least amount of cost while maintaining quality all along the way. And this will really allow employers to create their optimal talent pipelines. One example of this is Lone Star College System, which some of you might be familiar with. They realized that they had a growing need for skilled workers in drilling and energy exploration in Houston. They then partnered with the International Association of Drilling Contractors to develop an 8-week certificate program that enables workers to get the basic skills they need to fill those positions at a reasonable cost. So this, again, will allow us to evaluate the performance of those providers that we've been able to identify. Next slide, please. The next piece of this is then to promote those leading providers, those that have proven themselves capable of providing you the highest quality talent with quick responsiveness. So I always see this as a win-win-win situation. The students and workers are able to succeed in that they have a clear understanding of the skills that their employers and potential employers are looking for. Institutions and providers certainly have a leg up in this if they are ordained as a leading provider. To have that strong relationship with employers certainly is a boost for them in terms of their recruiting efforts. And then obviously the employers have the opportunity to get that talent to them for a lower cost at a quicker amount of time. So there's certainly a triple advantage to working and leading opportunities to identify lead providers. So once employers have established their preferred providers, students and workers are then better able to connect with employers by accessing those networks and have a clearer line of sight between where they are and where they want to be. So this, of course, illustrates that idea of having a real transparent career pathway rather than a theoretical one. Backhaul Direct is a great example here, and they are a small logistics business based out of Indianapolis. They figured out that 90% of their hires came directly out of 4-year programs, so they began tracking their return on investment for each university from where they hired. They were able to measure things like time spent recruiting and associated costs, and then compared that to the number of interns and full-time hires that their relationships with those organizations produced. From there, they found a handful of small universities that provided what they considered their top-tier talent. And from there, they decided to work to improve the relationships of where those shortcomings were so that they could result in a truly great to recruit hire ratio among their applicant pool. So this was a very strategic approach that not only improved their retention rates, but it also produced more applicants from their preferred provider because they were using peer-to-peer networking. Next slide. And then actually, if you would, there we go. So for a very long time, we've been certainly working in a silo-measured strategy. We think that it's much more important for us to be thinking along the lines of end-to-end performance. We know that these things cannot happen in a vacuum, so we need to be thinking through rather than reporting up. We are missing responsiveness across partnerships. So with talent pipeline management, our employer-focused measures track the end-to-end performance across partners. We think that this creates a much clearer line of communication between the employers, the providers, and the prospective employees. This is where we do feel that economic developers within government can be really critical. They're very well positioned to be the coordinators of the employer community as they develop and execute their talent strategies. Next slide, please. So in July of this year, we released a paper called Talentflow Analysis. It is one of the 6 strategies that we outline in the Talent Pipeline Management white paper that we released in November of 2014. Talentflow Analysis is this idea of the inflows and outflows of talent. So this graphic just provides you with an illustration of what that really means. So if you look to the right of the screen at the top where it has provider A and provider B, those are 2 providers that we consider to be of high quality talent. As well as quite responsive to employer needs. So the ultimate goal is to increase the number of students or potential employees that we get from providers like provider A and provider B. Whereas provider E and provider F on the left side of the screen, they don't have as high of quality and they don't have as quick responsiveness. Those are providers that we would probably want to phase out, or you would look for opportunities to help them understand where it is that their shortcomings are. So this hopefully nicely illustrates what we hope to accomplish with Talentflow Analysis. And next slide. So what's next for our network? We selected 7 business or chamber organizations to receive funding as part of our Talent Pipeline Management Network. So they have been executing for the past several months various strategies from the Talent Pipeline Management idea of applying supply chain principles to your talent. Some of those have actually been able to exhibit talent flow analysis, which has been really exciting. One example of that is the Arizona Chamber of Commerce has been working on a project called A for Arizona, in which they're trying to emphasize the recruitment, training, and retention of very talented educators to work in what they consider to be A-grade schools, including those who will lead, create, and transform schools. So we will get to have an in-person meeting with them in the next couple of weeks to hear more about the development of their programs. We are also working with a number of organizations across the country as part of our youth employment network, in which we'll be identifying some opportunities for asset mapping so that they can identify what are their most in-demand industries that they can then infuse their youth hiring strategies into their overall business strategies. So we find great value in our partnerships with local and state chambers of commerce and business-related organizations, and are certainly happy to identify what promising approaches have worked well for them and then distribute that information to the masses. So happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And just a couple of reminders as we move into the question and answer session. We have about 10-15 minutes remaining for questions. So if you have a question, please type it into the chat box, and we will pose some of those to the panelists. And if we don't get to your question on the webinar today, we will certainly ask the proper panelists to follow up. And you can always feel free to contact WDQC for questions as well. So Jay, why don't you start us off? We got some questions about the kinds of reports that LifeTrack, the state longitudinal data system in Mississippi, is able to produce. So one question in particular is the extent to which LifeTrack follows up with high school students, both as they go into post-secondary education, and is there a way to track high school students who don't go right into further education but go into the workforce?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. As I said, we've done about 300 reports now, and we do 2 types of reports. One is what I would call a standard type of report that many of the state agencies that are listed as a part of our governing board, they have these kind of reports that they have to make to the federal government, to state oversight groups. And so we use the information in the SLDS program to actually prepare those reports for them. and they become fairly standard in terms of doing that when they're required. And there's really no data analysis going on there. It's simply accessing the data and putting it in the columns and reporting it to the specific entity. The ad hoc reports are different. Those can range over a wide variety of areas. The initial criteria that we put on that is, number one, do we understand what the question is asking for? Number two, or the results that they're asking for. Number two, do we have the data that we can conclusively answer the question and do the analysis? And we took a long time to put together a system whereby the requests come in, we go through that process of analyzing whether we've got the data, is it a question that we can truly understand and answer, and then we have 5 different representatives from our research universities and community colleges that are involved, and there are technical integrity panel that look at the validity of information and so forth. I want to give you that background. So when we turn out a report, we feel very, very confident about what it says, and we can track, and the way we track, whether it's high school students or whether it's individuals that are involved in receiving some type of service from a state entity, is we use an identifier number, so Social Security number, that is sent into our group, that our state data clearinghouse. They didn't remove the Social Security number and give it a 10-digit code that is randomly selected, so that you completely lose the identity of the individual, because we're more interested in what the aggregate data says. We're not interested in an individual. We have other criteria. There's a variety of different criteria. You can't use a number that's below a certain number so that you could conceivably go out and determine who the individual might be. And so we follow all the appropriate federal guidelines in terms of how information is utilized on individuals and so forth. And that took a very, very long time in order to ensure that we were totally following all of that criteria. Then once we were able to do that, then the various kinds of reports come in. Give you an example. One we had was how many people were graduating from university with a teaching certificate, and then how many of them were actually still teaching within the state, looking at what your loss ratio was in terms of people with teaching certificates, because in some areas they have trouble finding teachers. On students, we can track students that go into some level of training beyond high school, for example. We can track whether they got a job post the training, how many years in that job, whether it had an impact on their per capita income, whether the job was in keeping or relevant to their training component, so that we can get an understanding as to whether the training is resonating both for the benefit of the individual as well as for the employer. So we can track, and by using wage records that we have through we call it employment security, but that's our version of the Department of Labor, we can track that. So we have that system in place to be able to track people really wherever they have a record of either service utilization, or if they're in school, to be able to track what happens to them over a period of time. And so I would emphasize that took a long time to put that system together so that it met all the checks and balances and all the proprietary, confidential information that needed to be put together in order to be able to do that. Once we've been able to do it, we've had a program that has operated very faultlessly over the last year and a half, and we've been able to produce some great reports.
Thanks so much, Jay. That's a great lead into a question that we have for Martha, which is, as Alabama is moving forward and is earlier in this stage of getting collaboration between different agencies and starting to think about linking data across different parts of education and the workforce, has there been any pushback from advocates for student privacy or any other kind of pushback politically as the longitudinal data system conversation has picked up?
thank you for that question. I would say that generally the attitude has been very supportive. We have tried to be very understanding of any privacy and security and confidentiality concerns. Most of the people on the Workforce Council have kids that are students and fully understand the value and the necessity of protecting privacy and confidentiality and security. That was actually the starting point from which the Workforce Council started, that if this wasn't something that could be done in a way that maximized security and privacy and confidentiality, then it wasn't something anyone was interested in pursuing. And so with that at the forefront, and that having been one of the key considerations from the beginning, I think that more people have felt pretty comfortable with what's going on in the state. That's not to say that we haven't had any questions, but we've tried to address them and to be proactive in doing so. And as a result, have really experienced broad support for an initiative that's being managed very well from a confidentiality and security standpoint.
That's great. And this is a question for really everyone on the panel, but Jamie, it would be great to start with you. If you can talk a little bit about some of the strategies in getting employers excited about workforce data and the potential of this data for them, and some of the challenges that they may face in implementing this type of model and in using data better, and how you answer these challenges and what kind of rationale and tools you can provide.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start off with that. Thanks, Rachel. So I think that in a lot of ways, employers are really excited when they're able to see what other companies have done with the use of data. So that's why we place a big emphasis on case studies. As I mentioned, a lot of them are on our website. And when you're able to demonstrate to them the benefits that they can reap from participating in these kinds of strategies, they really do start to see that it's worth the time investment, the cost investment, which is usually somewhat nominal, especially because they have so many of these data resources at their fingertips, including both their internal data and then, depending on the state, what they have available to them when it comes to their state resume banks, et cetera. One of the challenges that a lot of folks face when they're starting to think about the talent flow analysis is because we do place an importance on the idea of identifying collaborators that you can work with to figure out if you can identify a couple of partners within your industry in which it would make sense to do some joint forecasting for what jobs are in demand, and if you can come to an agreement in what terms of competencies you're looking for, that can be so powerful when you're communicating with providers so that they're not just hearing it from one employer. A unified voice can be a lot stronger, and they are more likely to respond if they're hearing it from multiple parties. So it's a hard thing to come to terms with, the idea of sharing this information with some of your competitors, but for those who have done it, we know of a group in Louisiana who has had a lot of success with it. They really do demonstrate that there is such great benefits to doing that.
Thank you. And Jay, to what extent have you been able to engage some of your employer colleagues in thinking about the state longitudinal data systems and the potential for understanding that data better and advocating for it? Does that message seem to resonate?
Yes, it does, and I would really agree with the points just made, that you really have to show the value. I mean, what's the value proposition to the business community? And I think that if you show that you are working closely with them, that you're responsive to their needs, that you understand exactly what they're looking for in terms of a workforce, and you are making efforts on the other end to ensure that your training dollars, your programs are really attuned to what their needs are, then they start to see what the value is. One of the things that we've done amongst several different programs that we put together, as a part of LiveTracks, we have a Mississippi Works application that any employer, it's a free app that you can put on your smartphone or you can put on your computer, and you can go to it and you can register job openings that you have. Also, people who are looking for a job or maybe underemployed can also go to the website and register, take a look at what jobs are available, and register on site. So for example, right now while we're talking, I can look at that app and tell you that there are almost 40,000 jobs that are open and available in the state. Now these are all different kinds. And so somebody looking for a job can go on, register, say what kind of training, what kind of experience they have. The employer can look on there, see who's registered an interest, and they can do all of this online from the comfort either of their business or their home, and you can connect people. And so that's a very valuable tool for businesses to be able to connect with people who are looking for a job, and they can do that and see what kind of skills and training that they might have. So those are the kinds of things that if we keep adding to the mix, then employers begin to see this has real value to me. Another program that we've had for a number of years called the Workforce Enhancement Training Fund is that when employers pay their unemployment insurance premiums, they pay a little bit of a rider on there. That goes toward funding workforce development programs at our community colleges. Those programs are directly tied back to the employer network through our State Workforce Investment Board, so that we are constantly monitoring the level of the training, the type of training, and making sure that it meets the need of the end user, the employer, and obviously meets the need of the individual being trained, because they then are able to get a job, keep the job, and it has an impact on themselves and their families. So when we're able to show value, then I think you can bring the employer community into the process, and they take more involvement in it than they have perhaps in the past.
That's great. And we just have time for one more question. And Martha, I'd like you to finish us off. Can you talk a little bit more about the next steps for Alabama's data system now that the governor's order has come out? What is the state looking into? What's the plan?
Yes, I'd be happy to talk about that. The state applied for one of the grants from the federal government for data systems through the Department of Education. We unfortunately did not receive that, in large part it looks like because we don't have a system that's already there, and most of the other grantees were receiving funding for ongoing operations as opposed to for system development. So now we're looking at getting the funding that's needed, and of course you have to go through the state budget funding cycle process. That's something that we have heard about, commitments to make sure that that is funded in the upcoming funding cycle. Once the office is funded, the group will begin working together, and we've actually got a timeline that's over 5 years with the implementation process, starting from when it's a really small office and building out the infrastructure all the way to the integration and linking of data records, and then ultimate use by our state and our regional workforce councils and our employers, and ultimately the platform that will be available to show de-identified aggregated information in a public front. So it's a multi-year process that we're looking at. That said, even though the office is not, it's created, but there are no official employees, there's been a lot of work that's been going on by leadership that is invested in making sure that we don't lose any time based on the lack of funding right now. And that we're going ahead and taking whatever actions we can and working behind the scenes. A lot of people are juggling this as a second responsibility on top of their primary job, making sure that we are continuing to make strides. So lots is happening, lots more will be happening in the years to come.
Well, that is great news and a great note to end on. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for joining us today and providing such excellent information. And thank you to our audience for participating. Folks can send any follow-up questions, and we will be looking at the questions that came in that we weren't able to get to and trying to follow up with everyone who submitted a question today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.